Well, hello, friends and members of St. Martin Lutheran Church. This is Pastor Jim. Today is Tuesday, March 30th. We're in Holy Week, and so my sort of message today. We're not going to be doing particularly a Bible study, but I'm going to invite you to imagine something with me. And we had a great service on Sunday. Apologies to some. We had, again, a little glitch with our live stream, and I believe it was for the late service. And, we're working these things out week by week in fear and trembling, so please bear with us. And we're actually trying to work on a system much like some of the bigger churches have, whereas you can watch the services live right from the website as opposed to going through Facebook or other things. And it's just us trying to up our game, if you will, as far as live streaming goes. So hi, Natalie and Sandy. Great to see you here. And a few thoughts before I get into it's kind of a mini sermon, if you will, today. Apologies ahead of time. This week my family's been gone in South Carolina on vacation, and they've been having a great time and sending me pictures back. And I've been at home either here at church or at Wellspring or working on my garage. And I'll tell you, if I never cut another piece of drywall again for the rest of my life, it will be just fine. I'm finding it's the havoc it wreaks on my hands. But the drywalling's done and the drywall mudding is done, which is maybe, as much as I can't stand cutting drywall and hanging it, it's the mudding and getting the seams right. That's a big pain, but that's all done. So you can say a cheer for me. And I'm hoping to have my garage project done before the family gets home, so my kids can have a nice workout room. That's what our garage has become. And I'm getting close to that. So it's been a sort of a fun Holy Week for me too, sleeping, working on the garage, and working here at church. And now, before we begin, I want to talk to you a little bit and use your imaginations a little bit. And I'm going to ask you to imagine that you were there on the events of Holy Week, the first Holy Week, 33 AD to 37 AD. We don't know the exact date, somewhere around that 4-year period. And so get your mind there. So that's kind of how this is going to go today. We're going to imagine together that we were there that week. And we're going to ask ourselves the question at the end, where do we stand? Where do we stand? So begin by imagine, if you can, you were there in first century Palestine during the events of the first Holy Week. And you're sitting at the side of the road near where it begins to incline toward the gate to Jerusalem. And you hear shouts and singing mixed with a great dust cloud in the distance, a sure sign that a large group of festival pilgrims are on their way into the holy city. And it's a happy crowd that walks by, and they're following a young man into the city. And he's seated on a donkey, which in a sense made it appear as if he was some form of important dignitary or some kind of an important person. And people are singing and shouting, and some are even singing specifically from Psalm 118, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And others are carried away in their excitement, and they stretch their tunics along the pathway so that the animal and his special passenger walk right across them. And others are waving palm branches that they had picked up along the way. And you hear someone mention that conquerors enter the city in this fashion with a lot of fanfare. But the difference is that this man comes alone, flanked not by an army of men, but flanked by thousands of lambs being brought into the city to be inspected for the sacrifice of the Passover that will happen later that week. And maybe you even think, what kind of a conqueror rides into the city on a donkey? I mean, it's kind of funny, but then someone mentions, well, didn't one of the prophets prophesy about such an entrance? Something about your peaceful king comes to you riding on a donkey. And then you watch as the crowd finished their trek through the gate and they disappear under the arch into the city. And like other Passovers, the city is packed with people from all over the world. With this many people all together in one place, you wonder if anything is possible. And the next day you enter the outer courts of the great temple with your family and friends, and a large commotion draws your attention. You were there to buy a dove, a sacrificial dove, to use as an offering and prayer in the temple. And as you approach the temple, specifically the court of the Gentiles, you notice a large flock of doves escaping through the pillars of the temple and up into freedom, into the sky. And someone remarks that probably a servant boy left some of the cages open. But then you hear the sound of a whip. And what is unmistakably tables being turned and kicked over. And you're hearing such angry curses from the merchants, you have to put your hands over the children's ears because you don't want them to hear the words that they're saying. Then you reach the court of the Gentiles, which you know is a place for non-Jews to pray and to meditate on God. You see a young man, and he's shouting, "Does not Scripture say that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it into a den of thieves." The religious leaders, the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, are obviously furious. Some were so upset that they were shaking. And then the wrath of the young man seems to fade very quickly. And he walks over to the side of the court and he begins to talk quite calmly with what you can only assume are his friends. And you also notice that the priests and the scribes, they're standing just close enough to listen in. Now, you can't hear what's being said, but then it dawns on you that there are other things you wanted to see in the holy city this week, so you take your leave. And the Passover holiday is certainly an exciting time in Jerusalem. You know, maybe you had planned this trip a long time ago, years ago, in fact. Every Jewish family hopes to make at least one pilgrimage to the holy city in their lifetime. The place is impossibly crowded, but that makes it even more exciting because perhaps you're from a small rural village where there's no more than a few hundred people, and now you're in a city which has hundreds of thousands of people. Well, it's Tuesday of that week now, and you see the young man again. Now, once more, he's speaking about the temple. Now, he's talking with a group of people, and the temple leaders are in attendance. And then you see a bearded priest ask, "By what power do you do these things?" Now, it's probably a reference to the turmoil that had been caused in the Gentile courtyard the day before. Now, the young man doesn't answer the question directly, but he counters with a question of his own. And he asks the scribes and the Pharisees about the power of a man named John. That where did John get his authority from? And then the young man said, "If you tell me where John got his authority, then I will tell you where I got mine." And he receives no answer. And then one man breaks through the circle of the temple leaders with a welcoming look on his face and his arms outstretched, and he, with dripping flattery, says, "Master, we know you're from God. We know that you're an honest man, that you teach the ways of God. So I ask you, are we or are we not permitted to pay taxes to the Roman emperor? Should we pay or should we not?" I mean, it's a question that all Jewish people ask at one time or another. And maybe you begin to wonder if this man is really here to overthrow the Roman government. I mean, the priests are obviously trying to get him to admit to his political aspirations by telling the Jews that they shouldn't pay taxes. By doing so, he'd become very popular with the crowd, with the masses, but unpopular with the Roman authorities. It seems like he's in a no-win situation here. No matter what he answers, he's going to be in trouble with someone. But then the young man raises his hand and he asks for a coin, and he takes the coin and he shows it around and he asks whose inscription is on it. Of course, everyone knew, so did he. It was the image of Caesar. And well, he responded, "Give to Caesar the things that belong to him." And then his voice raised and he said, "And give to God the things that belong to God." The questioner's warm demeanor dissipates. He scowls and he returns to the group. And then the man's not done with the religious leaders. He turns to them and he says, "Beware of the doctors of the law, who love to walk up and down in long, flowing, beautiful robes, receiving respectful greetings in the streets, and to have the best seats in synagogue and the places of honor at feasts. These are men who eat up the property of widows, all the while saying long prayers for appearance's sake. They will receive the severest sentence." You leave the uncomfortable interaction between this young man and the religious leaders. And maybe even in the back of your mind you feel a little bit bad for them because of the scolding that they had received from this young man. And you return to your lodging for the evening and you start a discussion and you start talking with your friends. Who is this man? Why did he talk as he did and act the way he did? Now, 3 days later, on the eve of the Passover, you found out more about him. The next time you see this man, it's obvious that he's been arrested by the Roman guard, struggling to carry a heavy wooden beam that you know to be the horizontal beam of a criminal's cross. You see a woman old enough to be his mother following closely behind, weeping, doing her best to keep up. The open wounds on his back and his legs and his arms showed that he'd already been severely beaten. He and 2 other criminals were being taken out of the city to be killed, or as the Romans sometimes put it, crucified and then allowed to die. Now, you'd never seen a crucifixion before, and therefore it has a grisly appeal. And you follow the young man at a distance after sending the children away, wanting to spare them this horrific scene. And you follow and watch as they take him to a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, where they strip his garment, nail spikes into his wrists and through his ankles, and then lift the cross into its place. And you're close enough to hear the flesh from his wrists and his ankles tearing. And it's too much for many in your group, and they have to look away. And then you observe a solitary man standing in front of the central cross where the young man hung. And you try to get close enough to hear what's being said. And the man never took his eyes from the cross, and you were able to catch part of what he was saying. You hear him say, "From around the Sea of Galilee he taught and he healed and he loved the people for whom the world was a hard and brutal place. He loved the people that everybody else discarded. He knew God like no one else. He asked for nothing himself. But the people wouldn't hear, and they laughed. Some listened. He said things like, 'Let your life be a candle and put it up on a stand where it can give light. Forgive others as you have been forgiven. And when you pray, say, Our Father.'" And then the man stopped and he closed his eyes for a moment, looking to the ground. And then he continued, and last night he took the cup and the bread and said to remember him always. And at that moment I walked out, the man said. I betrayed his trust. I did it for 30 pieces of silver, coin with Caesar's face stamped on it. And as you watch this interaction, it didn't make sense what the tearful man was saying. The young man upon the cross must have been a teacher or perhaps a doctor of medicine. But it sounded like he was a new religious leader as well. And the words of this troubled man crystallized what you had been trying to comprehend when you looked into the face of this young man. And all you saw was love and kindness and concern and truth and faith and light. And you saw those things even on the burden of the cross. And the words that the man said begin to resonate in your ears. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Well, the rest of our group, your group, decided to leave the scene and perhaps stay until the Sabbath was over on the first day early on in the week. So remember that there were people there that week, countless people. Countless people with a variety of stories and experiences. Imagine you were there that first Holy Week. Amongst the people there was the crowds, nameless people in a group. They were the ones who shouted Hosanna and a few days later shouted Crucify. Earlier in the week, the scribes and the Pharisees couldn't stop Jesus because they feared the crowds. Later in the week, Pilate couldn't stop the crucifixion because he feared the crowds. And there was Judas, so disappointed that he struck back, perhaps trying to initiate events of his own accord. There were the other disciples that when they were put under pressure, they ran, not truly comprehending who the master was. There was Peter, who stood strong and bold, and yet he had his weaknesses too. He confessed allegiance, and yet he denied. There was the force of Roman law. There was the intrigue of the Jewish religious authority, threatened and determined to have blood. And there were the women who followed, even to Calvary. Now, of course, Holy Week is not the whole story. Easter is about to break. And that affirmation is our hope, our reason for being, our strength. But for now, simply ask yourself, where do you fit in Holy Week? Who do you stand with? And yet also knowing that this week we don't jump too quickly to Easter joy. We have some steps of the journey to go through before we get there yet. Well, the song that I'd like to perform badly for you is called Were You There? And Were You There? This is an African-American spiritual dated sometime in the 19th century. Many believe just predating the Civil War, so that would be pre-1861. And this hymn, Were You There, was first published in 1899 in a hymnal called Old Plantation Hymns. And you know, this song was taken, many believe, from another song written in Tennessee early on in the 18th century. Have you heard how they crucified my Lord? And it was sort of rewritten to take on a new stance. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And you know, this song reminds us that, in our story we just went through, imagining ourselves in first century Palestine during the events of Holy Week, that, we who have claimed Christ as Lord of our life, we're part of this thing called the church, right? Which is the believers across the globe, which crosses over denominational boundaries, and it unites us in our shared confession that Jesus is Lord, and not Caesar, and not our country, and not wealth, and not our family, but Jesus is Lord. And the church joins this week in coming and trembling at the foot of the cross. And if we were going to ask ourselves, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Well, maybe we weren't there in person, but we were there because our sin put him there. So in a sense, we were there. At least our sin was. Bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Receive the Lord's blessing. Be a blessing to others. I love you guys. Lots of opportunities to worship the Lord this week. I hope you're able to join us, and may God bless the rest of your day.